I are going to talk about Techgnosis and the occult today. We've brought with us some virtual reality experiences that you may be able to try just down the corridor. One of them is called the Seventh Ray and is inspired by Gnostic traditions and the mystery schools of ancient Greece. And Carl, I run a little lecture club in Hastings. I don't know if any of you know Hastings on the south coast of England. And I met Carl, he was giving a talk at my Explorers Club about how to think your way out of Plato's cave. And we became friends, and we went to see Irving Finkel give a talk about the royal game of at the Atlantis bookshop. And whilst we were there, we thought to ourselves that it would be quite good if we could use the modern technologies to give people a transcendental experience. So we came up with this idea of developing technology to undo the damage caused by technology, essentially. Oh yeah. So this is Irving Finkel, and he's a very eccentric and exciting curator at the British Museum, and one of just a few curators there that can read cuneiform. And he came, he was going to come and give a talk at my club. He ended up not coming. But I did get someone else from the British Museum come to talk. His name was Dr. Berger Kornersberg Helgestad, and he talked about the Royal Cemetery. And I found a recipe online. Irving Finkel makes lots of YouTube videos, and he made a little video about how to make Mesopotamian stew. And he talked about rare Mesopotamian herbs, one of which I remember was called slave girl's buttocks, but I don't know what that is, but I imagine it looks like a sort of heart-shaped leaf. That's what I like to think anyway. What's that one? Oh yeah, so the reason I got into this kind of thing was because I give talks and workshops about lucid dreaming, and I've practiced lucid dreaming since I was a child, and I actually think that some of the techniques that you use in lucid dreaming and creating a lucid dream experience, especially from full wakefulness, are similar to visionary techniques in terms of something like scrying or divination. You start to look through space rather than look at or focus on particular objects in your sphere of vision. So this is an archetypal character or an ancient goddess, a titan of the ancient Greek pantheon called Mnemosyne. And she really interests me because she's the personification of memory, and her whole story and her whole character and her qualities show something about the idea of what consciousness was to ancient Greek people. And I think it was something quite different to what consciousness is to us these days. I think it was more of a sense of a connected, integrated intelligence and remembrance of your part of the whole cosmos and order of things. So Mnemosyne is the personification of memory, and she's also responsible for making sense and reasonable, articulate conversations, being able to express yourself effectively, using the right words, and was often invoked by orators and poets when they had to recite a long piece of poetry or a talk. And she's features in quite a lot of interesting different rituals in ancient Greek traditions. This is a Orphic scroll. It's a Orphic gold tablet, and it's a very small piece of hammered out gold. It's only about this big. This one's on display at the British Museum, and it basically gives Orphic initiates instructions as to what they must do when they enter the underworld. And it says something like, when you enter the underworld, you'll come to a white cypress tree and you're going to be absolutely gasping for a drink, but you mustn't drink from this water, because this is the water of Lethe, the water of forgetting. You must continue to the pool of Mnemosyne and drink from the pool of memory, and you have to ask the guardian there, you have to say, I am a child of the earth and starry heavens, permit me to drink from the water of memory so that I may take my place amongst the other initiates. And this kind of brings us into hydromancy and this idea that water has a memory, and by observing it and watching it and drinking it, you can take on the qualities of the sort of universal earthly memory. Julian James wrote this book. It's kind of discredited by a lot of contemporary neuroscientists, but I think it brings up some really interesting issues about the nature of consciousness and how it might have developed in human evolution. And I think that something that happened to us, we were talking last night about this idea of why is human language made us so separate from the rest of the natural world? What makes human language so different? Like birds, animals, plants, trees, they all communicate with one another, but their language is in sync with more of a natural system, a sort of intelligent, integrative way of communicating, a chemical, electrical, rhythmic system of communication. And we've developed this abstract language. And maybe like a good metaphor, that is something like the Tower of Babel, whereby we've created chaos by making this abstract form of communication that, although it's very beautiful, means that we have this division between us and the rest of the natural world often. And one thing that comes out of that, and that kind of consciousness that is a construction of human culture and technology, is our perception of time. And I think our perception of time has massively influenced our experience of consciousness. And that the technology of the time defines the experience of consciousness as far as human beings is concerned. Depending upon what technology we're using, our experience of the world and reality, the way we see it, is influenced. So Carl and I have developed this virtual reality project called The Seventh Ray, and it's an attempt to give people the opportunity to have an experience of a mystery school initiation process, essentially. So using some of the elements, and the idea is, can we use technology to give people transcendental experiences? Can we create, is the environment and is the sort of sensory input enough to give someone a transcendental experience? And one of the things that strikes me about using technology in this way is that a lot of it, I think, is about the way in which we see the world and the way in which we see reality and the kind of framework that we have for making sense of the world around us. And it brought up a lot of my feelings and ideas about when I was a kid and how I used to see reality. And I can remember doing these various kind of visual eye tricks before I went to sleep, and I think that's what gave me a lot of lucid dreams. I used to make myself go cross-eyed and see things differently and see different layers of reality. And for an example, I had a cabin bed when I was a kid, so I was quite high and close up to the ceiling. And my dad had got drunk and paint rollered the ceiling. And in the beginning, the ceiling was all quite sensible and straight. And the more pissed he got, it went like swirly and weird. And so I used to get quite lost in looking in that. And my eyes would go kind of soft and I'd start to see patterns emerging. And then from that, I would go into a dream. And I think early humans just had that practice a lot more. Now we're constantly overstimulated with very visually rich and well-defined visual stimuli, so we have less opportunity to lose ourselves in like watching our nan smoke a fag or something like that I used to find relaxing and would become hypnagogic after a while. So one of the things that I remembered, I looked it up today because I couldn't remember whether I just dreamt it and imagined it or whether it was actually true, but apparently Mayan parents used to try to encourage their children to become cross-eyed. And I think there's something in being cross-eyed or getting a soft gaze where you start to see things slightly differently, and maybe you're seeing more kind of with your third eye in some instances, like instances of things like blind visionaries where they don't obviously have any sort of visual capabilities, but they still manage to see things or come up with visions. So in order to do this, Mayan parents would put a little amulet in between the eyes so that the eyes would become permanently crossed. And one of the examples I give about the sort of visual experience you need to get into in order to start having these visions come up is similar to the way you look at a magic eye picture. Don't know if you're familiar with this, but it was like big in the 80s. And you have to look at it a certain way. And one of the things that always helped me actually was if it was framed and if it was behind glass, you start to look at the reflection in the glass and then you start to see through it. So it's a technique that you can use to start accessing this. But with virtual reality, you're given this opportunity to be in a much more immersive environment. And instead of looking at a flat screen, you feel like you're inhabiting a space. So I think that potentially has really good, might potentially have a good impact on the way that human beings experience media and don't lose their visionary capabilities. I think with technology, with especially screen time and phones and watching films and watching TV, we've created a sort of mirrored dimension that we're now trapped in. Our invention of language has created this kind of overlaid system of reality, and we've distanced ourselves from the natural order of things. I think we gave the example, we used the picture of Alice in Wonderland in Through the Looking Glass. And it's interesting, the age of Alice in Wonderland, when she starts to have these experiences, because when you kind of hit pubescence, the neural pathways in your brain prune back so that you're able to focus on particular ideas and things, and you can start to prioritize. But when you're younger, everything is of equal importance. You don't have those sorts of filters. And so one of the things in dreaming practice I do is get people to remember, especially something like their childhood home from when they're about 8, very, very vividly. And you will find that you can remember stuff about your childhood home at around that age that you wouldn't remember now, like things like what the caps of taps looked like and stuff like that. Like, you just remember details in a way that you don't remember them as you get a bit older. And so as Alice grows up, as she starts to sort of discern what's important and what's not, everything in this mirror universe is named, and a lot of wordplay comes in and things like that. And I think that's quite interesting in terms of consciousness. One thing that's kind of happened to us as a species is we've stopped not knowing what to expect, and I wonder how that might have affected our consciousness. Like, now that we pretty much know what to expect about everything, it's hard to get into a state of appreciation and not anticipation of what's coming next. One example I like thinking about is, when sailors went on big long voyages on boats and they didn't know if they might fall off the edge of the world. I think that must have been quite an extraordinary, amazing state of consciousness to be in. And when they arrived in those countries, they would see something like an elephant and they would draw this weird thing because they'd never seen an elephant. And so when they tried to describe to people what it looked weird and it looked different. And I think that it's underestimated the power of the unexpected. Like, we expect so much, we anticipate what we're going to see next. We go to a foreign country, we know what it's going to look like because we've seen photographs of it. We know what all animals look like, really, because we've seen photographs of them. And early humans hadn't seen a lot of the world. They'd just seen that sort of small area of it, and there was a lot more mystery. So I think what language and technology has done, and what we are trying to undo somewhat, is created this division between nature. And I think that nature is of an electrical, chemical and rhythmic nature, and we've developed our own time systems and our own patterns and rhythms that are creating disharmony and chaos in ourselves and in our societies. So this is like a map of the circadian rhythms of human beings. This is really useful if you want to do dream work, to work out the optimum times to go to sleep, because I think it's quite important. I think we're really overstimulated with light, so often we can't go to sleep at the time that we should be going to sleep, which is when we're in the dark. I think artificial light has created a kind of chaos and confused programming for human beings. We should be able to recognise patterns, but we can't. I'll give an example of one piece of technology that I think is quite nice is, the app you can get on your phones where you can hold it up to the stars and you can work out the constellations. And it's something that really helps you appreciate that ancient people would just know that, and that knowledge would have been kind of intrinsic to them, and so they would have had a much greater sense of their belonging in the ancient world and their position in time and space. So going back to this idea of hydromancy and I guess sensory deprivation in order to bring out the inner sense, we've become a bit obsessed with the material and with the outer experience and with stimulus, but actually in order to have these visionary experiences we need to go inward and have an inner experience and bring out inner visions. So hydromancy is a form of divination that's been used by ancient cultures for thousands of years, and it's kind of changed throughout time to use different forms to express itself. But I love the idea of hydromancy, because looking into water for divination, this idea that water connects everything on Earth and it has a memory of everything that's ever happened, there's sort of subtle vibrations in water that I think ancient people may have been able to make sense of because they could make more sense out of the pattern nature of the world. This is cymatics in a bowl of water, and I wonder whether I had an experience once. I think it's the next slide. After I'd done a Vipassana retreat, I was meditating and I heard a bird sing outside of the window, and when I did, I saw the cymatics of the bird song in the other side of my eyelids, and I wondered if ancient human beings experienced sound. They probably had a more synesthetic sense than we did. You know, they had a synesthetic experience of reality, perhaps more than we did. I really love Rudolf Steiner, and I think that he has quite a neat expression of how I intuit reality to be. And in the knowledge of the higher worlds, there are various exercises you can do to cultivate your spiritual senses, your organs of perception for the spiritual dimensions. And essentially, the idea is that all things are spirit, but there's kind of finely vibrating matter, and there's more densely vibrating matter. And the more densely vibrating matter is everything around us on Earth that's material, and the more finer vibrations are more spiritual dimensions. So I think that's how I perceive this idea of multiple dimensions, is that things are just more densely vibrating or more finely vibrating, and depending on where you are, you can perceive reality in totally different ways because of that. So the black mirror is almost what technology offers us today. We've kind of got something like the obsidian mirror. This is Tezcatlipoca, which is the Mayan god smoking mirror. And he was the god of the night and spirits, and was associated with the jaguar. And the obsidian mirror was a tool for divination in ancient times, and then also used by John Dee to see and communicate with the angels and spirits as well. And the black mirror, the obsidian mirror, is on display at the British Museum. Often out on hire, actually, and I always like to wonder who's hiring it. So now we have this. This is our contemporary black mirror. I mean, I suppose if your phone dies, you could start using it as a divination tool. That might be useful. But this is something potentially that we can use. We can actually create sensory deprivation because people are so unwilling to undergo sensory deprivation. Maybe we have to create an artificial sensory deprivation in order for people to experience what comes out of their inner worlds then. I do think, I've got a 10-year-old daughter, and I wonder about children looking at devices these days and not developing that imaginary capability sometimes. And I think that one of the biggest things with devices, and why technology's kind of divided us even more dramatically in recent years, is the fact that it emits light, and it emits a fake light. And I think that we should all be receiving our intelligence and our electrical codes really from the sun, but instead we're receiving overstimulation from devices and blue light. And historically, obviously, we've worshipped the sun, we've worshipped Ahura Mazda, we've worshipped Aten, and this is a nice depiction of Aten disseminating knowledge or disseminating energy to Akhenaten and his wife and children that look a bit weird, his kids, don't they? Like maybe aliens or something. So I think, this is what we're trying to do with Seventh Ray. We're trying to create a technology that can help people reconnect and spark the curiosity and imagination to start exploring these things. We don't want to create a perfect world for people to escape in. It's more about allowing them to remember in the spirit of mnemosine, allowing them to remember that they have these capabilities within themselves all the time. So I call it scry-fi. So next time your phone won't turn on and you've got no battery or you've got no signal, you could maybe use it as a divination tool and practice that, looking into your phone as if it's a magic eye painting. That's it. It was about 15 minutes. That's not bad. Thank you.
Okay, thanks everyone. So I'm going to talk about how technology will not save us. So we're currently facing this sort of scenario, and we're boxing ourselves in really rapidly, and I'm trying to get us out of the box. We're also experiencing some really quite frank 12 years before we experience runaway climate change. We've got a parallel ritual happening in London. Danny Nemo's going to do one at the panel session here at 6:30, so please join us. Yeah, but the IPCC report is saying that we've got 12 years before we have basically runaway climate change. So how do we move from basically a consumer-based model? How do we use magic? How do we use the occult to break out of this consumerism to much more making context? So stop making content, start making context. And what I mean by that is, how do we create new ways of perceiving the world as the new content? Because we've got a massive resources problem. We can re-experience the content we've already got by changing the way we perceive. And a lot of the technologies we've got don't lead to an augmented reality, they lead to a diminished reality because they only explore vision, they only explore sound. So we've got examples now where it's a game called Bloodsport, and it's a shoot-'em-up game like most games, but the difference is that in this game you're also linked up to a drip, and every time you get shot in the game you actually have blood taken from your body. It's the last man standing wins, and basically everyone's a winner because the gamers love it because it leads to a real sense of real-world loss. And the blood bank, all the blood is donated to the blood bank, so everyone's a winner. So how do we stop this voyeurism? For instance, with VR experiences of being a refugee. I mean, again, because you're not involving enough of the context, you don't have enough investment, you can take the headset off, there's really not enough there to make a big empathy engine, for instance. How do we get the rich people to redistribute their wealth? How do we get to experience more than the 1% of the visual spectrum, more than 1% of the auditory spectrum that we actually only experience? So how do we experience more of reality with these transformative technologies? We've got this basic opportunity to enter a non-dual operating system. We're a wave, an individual wave on the ocean, but we cannot be that individual wave without being the entire ocean, and having that shift of perspective that you can actually get through technology is hugely important. I mean, we think we're sitting inside a room. We think we're sitting inside a room, but actually that room is sitting inside us. So how can we use technologies to create that basic new way of seeing? So how do we use technology to hack the individual sense of self and our relationship to the world? And I'm going to show you a bunch of different ways of visual and auditory ways of hacking the body swapping, gender swapping, spending time out of body, spending time in the third person. And we do this in order to increase the dynamic range of our experiences of reality, in order to reprogram associations. Seeing yourself from other people's perspectives may radically change your behavior. And also, how do we experience ourselves in these different ways? I mean, there's multiple selves within ourselves. And I'm really interested in shamanism and Roy Ascott's take on this idea of double consciousness. The state of being which gives access at one and the same time to two distinctly different types of experience. The shamanic trance, in which the shaman is both in the everyday world and at the same time navigating outermost limits of other worlds, is arguably now mirrored by our ability to move through infinities of cyberspace whilst within the structures of the material world. So immersion in this noetic simulation may induce real changes of consciousness and eventually real transformations of self. This techno-shamanism may lead to an evolution of cognition where the subject-object relationship is dissolved and reality begins to be actively constructed rather than passively observed. So I'm really interested in how we can get this idea across, this non-dual operating system, how we can activate it, because we need to act quickly. And if you know if you know I am both of us, and so are you, you're going to start changing the way you behave in the world. So I'm really interested in, these sorts of metaphors, these sorts of ways of seeing the world. And reality itself is becoming programmable in all sorts of different ways. But if reality is programmable, then reality again becomes a medium. So one more quote. One aspect of our being is like a machine, and the other aspect is like an engineer. In this view, the first step towards waking up is to recognize how zonked out and automatic we already are. Such dispassionate and reductive observations can paradoxically enable us to cultivate some of the most deeply human aspects of being. The machine thus comes to serve as an interactive mirror, an ambiguous other we both recognize ourselves in and measure ourselves against. This creates a path whose buzzing circuits and command overrides represent both the perils and promise of techgnosis. So there's so many different ways of actually creating these new tools for creating context. So we can change, we can adopt new visual systems, we can adopt, for instance, 360-degree vision, which I've worn for a week. It only takes your brain 15 minutes to adjust. And imagine if you have 360 vision as a new input to your brain. You've got here the decelerator helmet that slows time down in real time, so you can start to see patterns emerge in the world that you never normally see. This is the Hear One active listening headset that enables you to augment, context engineer your sound environment so you can remove certain sounds like people snoring. The rest of the sound environment remains intact. And how do we actually get into different umwelts? So an umwelt is this idea that you have a sensorial system. Different species have different sensorial systems. They experience the same world very differently. So here we can experience hammerhead vision, for instance. Here we have the experience of at least experiencing the motion of being in a dolphin. You've got insect vision. You've got this guy here who thinks that we're not going to evolve to become machines, but rather devolve, and he's already become a goat. So we've also got the other senses I mentioned. Let's look at context. Let's look at filling the context with as much sensorial information as possible. This is research in Japan, augmented endurance, where they found out things are less heavy if they're white. So all the gyms have got black dumbbells, so they've actually used augmented reality to project white onto those dumbbells, and you can pull more weight. They've actually got scientific published papers about this. This is the Wristify, which enables you to adjust your own body temperature, because everyone has different needs when it comes to air conditioning. This is the Aroma Fork, which mixes smell and taste. I've tried this experience, which is to put on a VR headset, which uses pass-through camera, so it turns it into AR. And what it was is that I literally looked out in the world, and everyone was in The Simpsons. So I realised very quickly, I moved my head, and literally everyone was in The Simpsons. So what you're going to see in the future, in the very near future, is not just, you won't just decide what you want to wear, you'll decide how you want to see. So real-time Photoshop for your eyes. You're already seeing this in terms of optical illusions. This is just paint. This is just paint on the floor to adjust your behaviour. Or here in Iceland, again, optical illusions being used to trick the mind. We're already in virtual reality. This is a nice example. So what does it mean when literally your reality becomes a medium? We already see it in Japan. Again, this is research I was involved in a couple of years ago, which is looking at increasing the size of your food as you eat it in order to trick the brain into thinking that you've eaten more or less than you actually have, depending if you're overweight or anorexic. So what are the dangers of this stuff? Multiple dangers, of course, because we are already losing common ground. If we're already in these massive, we have the opportunity to create our own universes and then not necessarily be able to communicate that information to others. Reality is already scary enough without it becoming something that you can infinitely change. And what happens when you mix up the senses and your eyes become another sense? It's your face, but somebody else is speaking through it. This is research happening where you literally use your face and another person's input is fed into it. So fake news galore. Another video.
Why we need those global institutions that are currently being pulled apart.
We are really acquiring divine abilities of creation and destruction. For the first time, we are going to have the ability to re-engineer life, to re-engineer bodies and brains and minds. And we have no idea what to do with these powers. If we just leave it to the free market, or if we just leave it to an arms race, it guarantees the worst outcome.
Which is why we need those global institutions that are currently being pulled apart.
Yeah, I mean, if you just, if you have an arms race in these technologies, then it's very clear what kind of human abilities are going to be optimized. It will be things like intelligence, things like discipline. Armies and corporations and governments, they want highly intelligent and highly disciplined soldiers and workers and citizens. But other things like compassion, like artistic appreciation, like spirituality, these are things that are not on a very high on the list of armies and corporations. So the attempt to upgrade humans might actually result in downgraded humans. Like what we do to the animals. If you compare a domesticated cow to a wild cow, so a domesticated cow produces more milk and is far more obedient, but in almost every other respect, it's a downgrade from the wild cows. And we are on the verge of maybe doing the same thing to human beings.
Okay, so this is all about the debate between hyperhumanism and transhumanism. And transhumanism is basically an attempt to extend human life, and not necessarily for any good reason. And I think that's a massive problem. So hyperhumanism is extending your healthy life, but also not using technology to become technology, but actually using technology as a prosthetic, much like the stabilizers on your bike. You wear the technology for a short period of time, and then you take the technology off, and you have the new skill. So it's creating muscles, muscles that actually are used rather than calcified. So can a revival of spirit and human values actually be attendant upon a new alliance with machines? Can we use the metaphor that we actually are machines as a wake-up call, and through understanding you are a machine that can take control of your own programming and conditioning? So some of the earliest sort of pedagogies of looking at how we can actually use really ancient pedagogies for updating our technologies. I did a lot of 3D modeling over about 7 years, and it really changed me doing that process. This is one of the, this is an abbey in Yorkshire, and it's very interesting because when you build such a complex building, even in virtual space, it creates a memory palace. And memory palaces are ancient technologies that allowed orators to not write anything down. So they had a virtual piece of architecture in their heads, and they would map different parts of that 7-hour speech into different parts of the architecture. And then all they needed to do was trigger go through the building in a walk and trigger the whole speech. So that is like augmented reality today, right? We're back in the world, we're embodied. How do we utilize ancient pedagogy with modern technology? And as Malevich says, the best way to approach the design of mixed reality or augmented space is to consider it an architectural problem, because the application of meaning on space is a native concern. So another real technology, an inner technology, this is what the hyperhumanism thing is all about. You use the inner technologies we already have, is perspective and shifting perspective. So having things like macroscopic vision, the Aborigines, for instance, always struck by the amount of Aboriginal art that looks like landscapes seen from above. And we can utilize technology today to create this new skill. So this is actually maps of Manhattan that have been created to give you the local view and the overview at the same time. So within one field of view, to be both in the world and to see yourself in it, the power of looking through and occupying your own field of vision. One more quick video. So what you're seeing here is footballers playing from the bird's eye view. That's their view. So the best footballers play from the stand. They have the local view and the view from the stand, from the overview. So another interesting movement in technology is Roy Ascott talking about this idea of the dry and wet wear. So moist media is when you combine the dry technology with the wet biological processes. And there's a huge link between psychedelics and virtual reality. There's a long-standing link. And a lot of people are exploring now what it's like to use virtual realities and take certain substances. So there's an actual group on Reddit called Rift in the Mind, and they're literally listing all the different technologies with all the different psychedelics. Ketamine specifically very good because obviously you disassociate and then you enter these spaces very readily. And there's lots of research being done around ketamine and depression, and actually there's clinics all over America now where you can have a ketamine infusion whilst being in a virtual reality. So this is moist media, it's a whole new science and is awaiting a lot of research. So just to finish off, this idea of entering another body, I've had an amazing experience, a life review. I don't know how many of you experienced a life review, but in this space, my life stopped and went in reverse. So I was able to be in my current state of consciousness, and then I was in all of the states of consciousness going backwards. And what was amazing about it was that my life became a product. I was able to literally enter anything in the scene, including objects, including other people. So I could be myself as I was then, myself as I was at the point of time, and also other people. And I could fully experience what it was like to be them, and so I was in 3 levels of consciousness. And I want to see this technology, if technology can get that good, give us that ability to break out of our limited reality tunnels, then that's, I think, a decent bit of technology. So your consciousness becoming the medium itself. One of my friends is in constant pain, and we've actually helped her to create a visualization of that pain. So a real-time visualization of the pain using sensors. And then she doesn't focus on changing the pain directly, she focuses on changing the visualization of the pain. So she creates this intermediary between herself and her pain, and she can manage the pain in a completely new way. So where does pain come from? How is it felt, imagined, and imaged? Can it be remapped and consequently refelt? So this is the basic premise of all of my research. If you start to look at reality as a model, it's much more likely to be negotiable, and if it's negotiable, it can change. So we've got some experiences next door. One of them is sound self. The full experience of sound self is you're controlling the visuals with your voice, but you also lie on a bed, and literally you lie in the field of your voice. So your voice vibrates the bed, and you're literally lying inside your own voice. 7th ray has already been mentioned by Sarah. I haven't got time to mention it too much of it now. It'll be available a bit later on today, and definitely all day tomorrow. So I've got some breakdown of what happens. I can't tell you anything because it's a virtual initiation and you have to go through the experience. Jose, his experience is virtual awakening. Death is only the beginning, again, fascinating stuff. And Gnosis, another experience we have available. So I'm really interested in this idea of inhabiting others, and there's a term called the Proteus effect from Stanford. The brain is so easily tricked precisely because it's spent a lifetime in its own body. It builds models of the world instantaneously based on lived experience and using split-second assumptions, namely that the eyes are attached to the skull. So what happens when this is an experience that's already 30 years old, teleexistence in Japan, you put on the headset and the gloves and you literally look at your body and you've got a robot's body, and you look to your right-hand side and you're sitting next to yourself. And it's so transformative that a professor in Army who I work with, he completely changed his career overnight because of this one experience. So this is gender body swapping to be another lab in Barcelona. Again, just super simple to create. You just switch the inputs on the Oculus and you're looking down and you're looking at your partner's body. And then if you add another sense, so if you add touch as well, you put your touch your body at a certain position and they're touching their body at a certain position. You literally swap bodies. You've also got now the experience of being a schizophrenic. You can get inside a schizophrenic's head using technology, and I'm really fascinated by that because, you know, I'm not just interested in technology for learning, for training, but also for really empathizing and having compassion for other people in very different positions than yourself. But this model of self is not the only one. A radically different yet complementary model is possible, that of a universal self, not bounded by the skin, a self whose essential quality is oneness with the rest of creation rather than separation from it. And a good example of that is Moon Rebus from Cyborg Nest, and she's got a prosthetic device here that shakes every time there's an earthquake in the world. So she literally experiences every earthquake. The more serious the earthquake, the more her arm starts to shake. So she's got a direct relationship with the world that nobody else has at present. I'm also very interested in the destruction of the animal kingdom that we are committing. So how do we really break out of our own species? And there's a raging debate about what it's like to be a bat in philosophy. And I met this guy recently in Barcelona. Hopefully he's here today. Joe's actually decided to literally become a bat. So instead of having a VR experience of a simulation of what bat vision might be like, he's using echolocation and linking it directly up to his brain via these sensors in his cheek. So again, going direct to the senses, you know, how much more transformative can we get? Obviously, it's hugely ethically questionable. On the other side of the coin is the Pollinarium, which we've built in at York Art Gallery, and that is something that's looking at a simulation of what it's like to be a bee. The Pollinarium invites you to adapt your perception to that of pollinating insects, where time slows down, scale is expanded, and vision augmented. Time passes more slowly for lighter animals with faster metabolisms. To a fly, the world appears in slow motion as they process 4 times more visual information per second than humans do. They see at 250 frames a second. So what would it mean for humans if our senses were augmented to experience the natural environment in this way? Perhaps this could help protect biodiversity and the future of pollinating insects, of which we heavily rely on. So this is how it looks. This is some of the experiences, so you're seeing from this very macroscopic perspective. This is how bees see in the UV, and these are some of the shots from the inside. So just to finish, you know, I'm always interested in creating user experiences, but maybe not just for our species. So what happens, I mean, this is very much a tongue-in-cheek idea, but these chickens, these battery hens, are actually like given a virtual reality experience. They're literally inside the matrix. They're on, you know, they're running around. They're having an experience of what it's like to be outside. How terrible or not so terrible is it? I mean, is it worse to be stuck in a shed, or is it worse to be, you know, inside of an experience where you're running around, or at least thinking you're running around? And just to finish, escaping flatland, this fish is actually driving itself around and breaking into another dimension. So to finish, conclusion. Perspective mediates consciousness. Seeing yourself from other perspectives generates shifts in consciousness. So number 1, we should create interventions that require the navigation of unfamiliar territory. Number 2, adaptation to alternative points of view expands our perceptual ability. And number 3, perceptual augmentation expands our capacity to be in the world. Thank you very much.